In the shadow of midnight, when even the palace walls seemed to whisper secrets, Captain Marcus Vale discovered something that would shake the very foundation of the kingdom of Eldoria. What started as a routine security check in the Queen Consort's chambers revealed a hidden passage that had been used for decades, a passage that connected the royal quarters directly to the heart of the enemy territory. But this wasn't just about a secret exit. This was about a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of power, where loyalty was a mask and betrayal wore a crown. The sound of footsteps echoing through ancient stone corridors would soon become the drumbeat of revolution, and one woman's desperate attempt to escape would expose the carefully orchestrated downfall of a kingdom that had stood for centuries. In a world where trust was a luxury few could afford, Captain Vale was about to learn that sometimes the greatest threats come from within the very walls you've sworn to protect. Captain Marcus Vale had served the Royal Guard of Eldoria for 15 years, and in all that time, he had never questioned the loyalty of those within the palace walls. The stone fortress had been his second home, its corridors as familiar as the lines on his weathered hands. Tonight, however, something felt different. The autumn wind howled through the ancient battlements, carrying with it an unease that seemed to settle deep in his bones. It was well past midnight when Marcus began his rounds through the royal quarters. King Edmund was away on diplomatic business in the neighboring kingdom of Astoria, leaving Queen Consort Isabella alone in the vast palace with only the servants and guards for company. The Queen Consort had always been a mysterious figure, arriving in Eldoria 5 years ago as part of a political alliance that many questioned but none dared oppose publicly. Marcus paused outside the Queen Consort's chambers, noting that the usual warm glow from beneath her door was absent. This struck him as odd, as Isabella was known to be a restless sleeper who often kept candles burning throughout the night. He pressed his ear against the heavy oak door, listening for any sound of movement within. Nothing. Following protocol, Marcus knocked softly 3 times and announced himself. When no response came, concern began to creep into his mind. The Queen Consort had received several threatening letters in recent weeks, anonymous messages that spoke of retribution and justice. While the Royal Council had dismissed them as the ravings of discontented citizens, Marcus had taken them seriously enough to increase security around her quarters. Using his master key, Marcus slowly opened the door and peered inside. The room was empty, the bed unslept in, and the evening gown that Isabella had worn to dinner lay carefully folded on a chair. But it was what he noticed next that made his blood run cold. The massive tapestry depicting the Battle of Thornfield, which normally hung flush against the east wall, was slightly askew. Marcus approached the tapestry with the careful steps of a man who had learned to trust his instincts. As he reached behind the ancient weaving, his fingers found the edge of what could only be a hidden door. The mechanism was well-oiled and moved silently as he pushed, revealing a narrow passageway that disappeared into darkness. The secret passage was clearly not a recent addition to the palace. The stonework was old, but well-maintained, and the floor showed signs of regular use. Marcus lit his torch and began to follow the passage, his mind racing with possibilities. Who else knew about this hidden route? How long had it existed? And, most importantly, where did it lead? The passage twisted and turned through the interior of the palace walls, sometimes climbing steep steps, and other times descending into what must have been the foundation level. Marcus counted his steps and tried to maintain his bearings, but the route was deliberately confusing, designed to disorient anyone who might stumble upon it accidentally. After what felt like an hour of careful navigation, Marcus finally saw light ahead. The passage ended at another hidden door, this one concealed behind a false wall in what appeared to be an abandoned building. As he emerged into the night air, Marcus realized with shock that he was now outside the palace grounds entirely, in the old merchant district that had been largely deserted since the trade wars began. Standing in the shadows across the narrow street was a figure that made Marcus's heart skip a beat. Queen Consort Isabella waited beside a black carriage, dressed in common traveling clothes and carrying a small leather satchel. She was not alone. 3 men in dark clothing surrounded her, their faces hidden by deep hoods, but their posture suggesting they were armed and dangerous. Marcus remained hidden in the doorway, watching as Isabella appeared to be in heated discussion with the men. From his position, he could not hear their words, but their body language suggested tension and disagreement. One of the hooded figures kept glancing toward the palace, while another seemed to be urging Isabella toward the waiting carriage. The realization hit Marcus like a physical blow. The queen consort was either fleeing the palace in secret or, worse still, meeting with potential enemies of the crown. Either scenario represented a threat to the kingdom that he had sworn to protect with his life. His duty was clear, yet something held him back from immediately intervening. Isabella suddenly looked directly toward his hiding place, and, for a moment, Marcus thought she had spotted him. Her eyes were wide with what looked like fear, not the confident demeanor he was used to seeing from her during court functions. This was a woman in distress, not a calculating traitor. But appearances could be deceiving, especially in matters of state. One of the hooded men grabbed Isabella's arm roughly, causing her to stumble. The gesture was clearly threatening, and Marcus saw her try to pull away. This changed everything. Whether Isabella was a willing participant in whatever conspiracy this represented, she was now clearly in danger. Marcus made his decision. Drawing his sword quietly, he stepped out of the shadows and called out in his most authoritative voice, "In the name of King Edmund, you will release the queen consort immediately." The three hooded figures spun toward him, their own weapons appearing with practiced speed. Isabella's face showed relief mixed with terror as she recognized her protector. The lead figure, taller than the others, spoke in a voice that carried a slight foreign accent. "Captain Vale, you should not have come here. This matter is far more complicated than you understand." The fact that this stranger knew his name sent chills down Marcus's spine. This was clearly a well-planned operation, not a random crime. But knowing his name also meant they had been watching the palace, studying its defenses and personnel. "I understand perfectly," Marcus replied, raising his sword. "You are threatening a member of the royal family on Eldorian soil. That is an act of war." The tall figure laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "War, Captain? The war began long ago. We are simply here to collect what was promised to us." Isabella found her voice at last, calling out to Marcus with desperation clear in her tone. "Captain, please, you must listen to me. These men are from my homeland. They say my brother is dead, murdered, and they blame the king of Eldoria for his death. They want me to return with them to face judgment." Marcus kept his sword trained on the nearest threat while trying to process this information. Isabella's brother, Prince Victor of Valeria, had been found dead 3 months ago under mysterious circumstances. The official report claimed he had died in a hunting accident, but rumors had persisted of foul play. "The queen consort is under the protection of the crown," Marcus declared. "If you have grievances, they must be addressed through proper diplomatic channels." "Diplomacy?" The tall figure spat. "Your king murdered Prince Victor to prevent him from exposing the truth about the trade agreements. Isabella was supposed to be our eyes and ears in your court, but she has been playing both sides, feeding information to her husband while pretending loyalty to Valeria." Marcus felt the world shift beneath his feet. If what this man said was true, then Isabella was indeed a spy, placed in the palace to gather intelligence for a foreign power. But her current distress suggested that her loyalties had become complicated, perhaps even shifted entirely to her adopted homeland. "Is this true?" Marcus asked Isabella directly, never taking his eyes off the armed men. Isabella's silence stretched for long moments before she finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was sent here to watch and report, yes, but I never intended for anyone to die. When I learned that Edmund had nothing to do with Victor's death, I stopped sending information to Valeria. These men are here because I refused their last 3 requests for intelligence." The admission hung in the air like a sword waiting to fall. Marcus now faced an impossible choice. His duty demanded that he arrest Isabella for treason and espionage. But the immediate threat came from the armed men who clearly intended to take her by force, possibly to her death. The tall figure sensed Marcus's hesitation and pressed his advantage. "You see, Captain, the woman you protect is a traitor to your crown. Step aside, and we will solve your problem for you." But Marcus had spent enough time observing Isabella during court functions to recognize genuine emotion when he saw it. Whatever she had done in the past, her current fear was real, and her claim about stopping her intelligence gathering rang true. More importantly, she was under his protection, and that duty superseded all other considerations. "My orders are to protect the queen consort," Marcus said firmly. "I will do so until my last breath." The tension in the narrow street reached a breaking point. The three Valerian agents spread out, trying to surround Marcus while keeping Isabella within reach. Marcus knew he was outnumbered, but his position near the hidden entrance gave him a slight tactical advantage. If he could get Isabella back into the passage, they might be able to reach the palace and raise the alarm. "Isabella," Marcus called out without taking his eyes off his opponents. "When I give the signal, run for the door behind me." But before anyone could move, the sound of approaching hoofbeats echoed off the narrow street's walls. The Valerians cursed in their native tongue, recognizing that their window of opportunity was closing. Marcus allowed himself a moment of hope that reinforcements were arriving, until he saw the riders emerging from the shadows. 6 more hooded figures on horseback rounded the corner, clearly part of the same operation. Marcus's heart sank as he realized the true scope of what he was facing. This was not a simple kidnapping attempt, but a military operation designed to retrieve a valuable asset and eliminate any witnesses. The lead horseman called out to his companions on foot, speaking in rapid Valerian. Marcus did not understand the language, but the tone was clearly one of command and urgency. The original 3 agents moved closer to Isabella, while the mounted figures began to dismount and surround the entire area. Isabella suddenly broke free from her captor's grip and ran toward Marcus, her face set with determination. "Captain, there is something else you must know. The secret passage leads to more than just the merchant district. There's an entire network beneath the palace, and maps showing every entrance and exit. If these men gain access to that information, they can infiltrate the royal quarters at will." Marcus felt his blood turn to ice. The implications of what Isabella was saying were staggering. The palace's security depended on the belief that there was only one way in and out of the royal quarters. If there were multiple secret passages, and if detailed maps existed, then King Edmund and the entire royal family were in constant mortal danger. "Where are these maps?" Marcus demanded, even as he prepared for the fight of his life. "Hidden in my chambers, behind a loose stone in the fireplace," Isabella gasped, reaching his side at last. "Captain, I swear to you, I never gave them that information. I was supposed to, but I could not bring myself to betray Edmund so completely." The Valerian leader, clearly tired of waiting, raised his hand and gave a sharp command. The 9 agents began to close in from all sides, their weapons drawn and their intentions clear. Marcus pushed Isabella behind him and raised his sword, knowing that his chances of survival were minimal, but his duty absolute. As the first blade clashed against his own, Marcus could only hope that someone at the palace would eventually notice the queen consort's absence and think to check for signs of struggle. But even if help came, it would likely arrive too late. The secrets that Isabella carried in her mind, and the maps hidden in her chambers, represented a threat to the kingdom that went far beyond the life of one woman or one loyal guard. The battle for the future of Eldoria had begun in a narrow street, fought in shadows and silence, with stakes that neither Marcus nor Isabella fully understood. But as steel rang against steel in the darkness, both of them knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The clash of steel echoed through the narrow street as Marcus fought with the desperation of a man who knew he was outnumbered but could not retreat. His sword work was precise and deadly, honed by years of training and real combat experience. But even his considerable skill could not overcome the odds he faced. Blood already flowed from a cut on his left arm, where a Valerian blade had found its mark. Isabella pressed herself against the stone wall behind Marcus, her mind racing through possibilities for escape. She could hear more footsteps approaching from both ends of the street, suggesting that the Valerians had planned for every contingency. Her heart hammered as she realized that Marcus was likely to die protecting her, all because of choices she had made years ago when loyalty seemed like such a simple concept. "Captain," Isabella whispered urgently during a brief lull in the fighting. "The passage behind us leads to a junction about 50 yards in. There is a second route that goes directly to the castle's lower levels, near the dungeons. If we can reach it, we might find help." Marcus parried a thrust from the tallest Valerian and managed to wound his attacker's sword arm in return. "Can you navigate it in the dark?" he asked, breathing heavily from exertion. "I have walked those passages many times," Isabella admitted, the shame clear in her voice. "I know them better than anyone except perhaps the man who showed them to me." The revelation that someone else in the palace had knowledge of the secret network sent a chill through Marcus that had nothing to do with the cold night air. If Isabella had been guided through these passages, then her presence in the palace and her access to sensitive information had been facilitated by someone with intimate knowledge of the castle's hidden ways. "Who showed you?" Marcus demanded, even as he fended off attacks from two directions. "Lord Chancellor Aldrich," Isabella confessed, the words tumbling out in a rush. "He said it was for my own protection, in case the political situation became dangerous. But I think now that he may have had other reasons." Marcus felt his world tilt once again. Lord Chancellor Aldrich was King Edmund's most trusted advisor, a man who had served the crown for over 20 years. If he was involved in whatever conspiracy Isabella represented, then the threat to the kingdom went far beyond foreign agents and reached into the very heart of the government. The lead Valerian, despite his wounded arm, pressed his attack with renewed fury. "Enough talk," he snarled in heavily accented English. "The woman comes with us, alive or dead. It makes no difference to our master." But Marcus had been using the conversation to assess his tactical situation, and he had noticed something important. The Valerians were being careful not to damage the hidden door behind him, suggesting they also knew about the passage system and planned to use it themselves. This knowledge gave him an idea that was desperate, but might provide their only chance of survival. "Isabella, when I say run, go through the door, but do not close it completely. Leave it open just enough for me to follow, but make them think you are trying to escape alone." Isabella nodded, understanding immediately. If the Valerians thought she was fleeing through the passage without Marcus, they might split their forces, with some following her and others dealing with him. It would reduce the immediate threat and give them both a better chance of surviving the next few minutes. Marcus waited for the right moment, when 3 of the agents had positioned themselves directly in front of the hidden entrance. With a sudden burst of energy, he launched a fierce attack that drove them back several steps, creating the opening Isabella needed. "Run!" Marcus shouted, and Isabella darted through the concealed door into the darkness beyond. As Marcus had hoped, 4 of the Valerians immediately pursued Isabella into the passage, while the remaining 5 continued to fight him in the street. The odds were still against him, but the situation had become manageable enough that his superior skill and defensive position might keep him alive long enough for help to arrive. Inside the passage, Isabella moved as quickly as she dared in the near-total darkness. She could hear the Valerians behind her, their heavier footsteps echoing off the stone walls as they tried to keep pace. But Isabella had one crucial advantage. She knew where the passage divided, and she knew which route led to a dead end. When Isabella reached the junction she had mentioned to Marcus, she deliberately took the left passage, which she knew led to a series of chambers that had once been used for storage, but were now sealed off. The Valerians, unable to see clearly in the darkness, followed the sound of her footsteps without realizing they were being led into a trap. After another 50 yards, Isabella reached the sealed chamber she remembered. Using strength born of desperation, she managed to squeeze through a gap in the old iron grating that blocked the entrance. The gap was barely wide enough for her slender frame, but she knew it would be impossible for the larger men pursuing her to follow. As she had hoped, the Valerians reached the grating and found themselves trapped, unable to continue pursuit, and forced to retrace their steps to find another route. This would give her precious time to reach the main passage and hopefully reunite with Marcus, if he had managed to escape the street fight alive. Meanwhile, Marcus had used the reduction in opponents to his advantage, managing to seriously wound 2 of the remaining Valerians and force them to retreat. But his own injuries were mounting, and he knew he could not continue fighting much longer. The sound of Isabella's pursuit had faded from the passage behind him, which he hoped meant she had successfully evaded capture rather than being overcome by her pursuers. Making a decision that went against every instinct of his training, Marcus abandoned his defensive position and retreated into the hidden passage, pulling the concealed door shut behind him. In the darkness, he paused to catch his breath and assess his wounds. His left arm was bleeding freely, and he had taken a painful thrust to his right thigh, but nothing seemed to be life-threatening if he could get medical attention soon. The passage was eerily quiet now, with no sound of pursuit from either direction. Marcus lit a small torch from his belt and began to make his way toward the junction Isabella had described. His military training helped him maintain his sense of direction even in the confusing maze of corridors, and he was able to move more quickly than Isabella had, despite his injuries. When Marcus reached the junction, he faced a choice between 3 different passages. The leftmost showed scuff marks and disturbed dust that suggested recent foot traffic, which likely meant that was the route Isabella and her pursuers had taken. The center passage was wider and showed signs of regular use, probably leading back toward the palace proper. The rightmost passage was narrow and showed no recent disturbance, making it the least likely to contain threats, but also the least likely to lead anywhere useful. Marcus chose the center passage, reasoning that if Isabella had escaped her pursuers, she would also head toward the palace to raise the alarm. As he moved through the corridor, he began to notice construction details that surprised him. The stonework was of the same quality as the main palace, suggesting these passages were not later additions, but had been part of the original design. Someone had planned for secret movement through the castle from the very beginning. After several minutes of careful progress, Marcus began to hear voices ahead. He extinguished his torch and moved forward carefully, trying to determine whether the speakers were friends or enemies. As he drew closer, he recognized Isabella's voice, but she was not alone. The other voice belonged to someone Marcus knew well, Sir Geoffrey Blackwood, the captain of the Night Watch, and one of his most trusted colleagues. Marcus approached the conversation carefully, staying in the shadows until he could assess the situation. What he overheard made his blood run cold. "You should have left with them when you had the chance," Sir Geoffrey was saying, his voice carrying a tone Marcus had never heard before. "Now we have a serious problem. Captain Vale knows about the passages, and he has probably already figured out that you are not the innocent victim you pretend to be." "I never pretended to be innocent," Isabella replied, her voice steady despite her obvious fear. "But I also never agreed to help you overthrow the rightful king. What you and Aldrich are planning is treason, pure and simple." Marcus felt his world collapse around him once again. Sir Geoffrey, a man he had trusted with his life on numerous occasions, was apparently part of a conspiracy that involved Lord Chancellor Aldrich and possibly others in positions of power. The scope of the threat to King Edmund and the kingdom was far greater than he had imagined. "Treason?" Sir Geoffrey laughed bitterly. "King Edmund has been selling our military secrets to foreign powers for years, weakening our defenses while he lines his own pockets. We're trying to save the kingdom from a monarch who would destroy it for personal gain." "That is not true, and you know it," Isabella shot back. "I have been in a position to observe the king closely for 5 years. He is guilty of many things, but selling military secrets is not one of them. Someone has been feeding you false information to justify your actions." Marcus realized he needed to hear more before revealing his presence. The accusations against King Edmund were serious, and If they were true, they would change everything about his duty and loyalty. But Isabella's defense of the king carried the ring of truth, and her refusal to cooperate with the conspiracy suggested she had come to believe in Edmund's innocence. "The evidence is overwhelming," Sir Geoffrey continued. "Lord Aldrich has documented proof that the king has been in secret communication with Valerian agents for months. Why do you think your homeland was able to place you so easily in the palace? The king knew exactly what you were and allowed it to happen because it served his purposes." "Show me this evidence," Isabella demanded. "I want to see these documents for myself." Sir Geoffrey hesitated, and in that hesitation, Marcus heard the doubt that suggested the knight was not as certain of his facts as he claimed. "The documents are safely hidden where you cannot tamper with them. Your word alone is not enough to convince Lord Aldrich to abandon our plans." Marcus had heard enough. Drawing his sword quietly, he stepped out of the shadows and into the torchlight where Isabella and Sir Geoffrey stood facing each other. Both turned toward him in surprise, their expressions revealing their different reactions to his appearance. Isabella's face showed relief mixed with concern for his obvious injuries. Sir Geoffrey's expression was harder to read, shifting quickly from surprise to calculation as he assessed this new development in an already complicated situation. "Sir Geoffrey," Marcus said formally, keeping his voice steady despite the pain from his wounds, "I need you to explain why you are meeting secretly with the queen consort in hidden passages beneath the palace, and why you appear to be discussing treasonous activities." Sir Geoffrey's hand moved instinctively toward his sword hilt, but he stopped short of drawing the weapon. "Captain Vale, you do not understand the full situation. The queen consort has been feeding information to Valerian agents, and King Edmund has been complicit in this activity. We're trying to prevent a disaster that could destroy the kingdom." "I understand perfectly," Marcus replied, his sword remaining steady in his grip. "I understand that you have been meeting with Lord Chancellor Aldrich to plan some kind of action against the king. I understand that you seem to have detailed knowledge of secret passages that represent a massive security breach. And I understand that foreign agents knew exactly where to find the queen consort tonight, which suggests someone provided them with inside information." The accusation hung in the air between them, and Marcus saw the moment when Sir Geoffrey realized that his position had become untenable. The knight's loyalty had been called into question by someone whose own loyalty was unquestioned, and the weight of evidence was shifting against him. "Geoffrey," Isabella spoke quietly, "if you truly believe the king is guilty of these crimes, then present your evidence openly. Challenge him in court, demand a formal investigation, call for testimony from witnesses. But do not destroy the kingdom with secret conspiracies and foreign interference." Sir Geoffrey looked between them, his resolve visibly wavering. "You do not understand the pressure we are under. If we wait for formal procedures, it may be too late. The Valerians are planning something that could happen within days, and if the king is truly working with them, we need to act immediately." Marcus felt the pieces of the puzzle beginning to align in a new pattern. "What are the Valerians planning, Geoffrey? And how do you know about it?" The question seemed to break something in Sir Geoffrey's resistance. "There's going to be an attack during the king's return ceremony next week. But we do not know whether the king is a target or a participant. Lord Aldrich believes the king has arranged his own assassination to make it appear that he died heroically defending the kingdom, allowing him to disappear with stolen treasury funds." The complexity of the conspiracy took Marcus's breath away. If Sir Geoffrey was telling the truth, then everyone in the palace was potentially in danger, regardless of their innocence or guilt. But the plan Aldrich suspected seemed almost too elaborate to be believable, which made Marcus wonder if someone was manipulating the Lord Chancellor just as effectively as they were manipulating everyone else. "There is only one way to resolve this," Marcus said finally. "We need to find these documents that Lord Aldrich claims to have, examine them carefully, and determine whether they are genuine. If the king is truly guilty of treason, then we have a duty to expose him. But if these documents are forgeries designed to justify a coup, then we have a duty to protect him." Both Isabella and Sir Geoffrey nodded their agreement, but Marcus could see the doubt in their eyes. None of them knew whom they could trust anymore, and the stakes of making the wrong choice could not be higher. The kingdom of Eldoria stood at a crossroads, and the path they chose in the next few hours would determine whether it survived as a legitimate monarchy or descended into civil war and chaos. The three unlikely allies made their way through the secret passages toward Lord Chancellor Aldrich's private chambers, each lost in their own thoughts about what they might discover. Marcus led the way, his military training allowing him to navigate the maze of corridors despite his wounds. Isabella followed close behind, her knowledge of the passage system proving invaluable when they reached confusing intersections. Sir Geoffrey brought up the rear, his conflicted loyalties evident in his hesitant movements. The passages beneath Aldrich's quarters were different from those they had traveled before. The stonework was newer, and the construction showed clear signs of recent modification. Someone had been expanding the secret network, creating new routes and chambers that did not appear on any official palace blueprints. The implications were disturbing, suggesting a level of planning and preparation that went far beyond simple espionage. When they finally reached the concealed entrance to Aldrich's chambers, Marcus paused to listen carefully. The room beyond was silent, which made sense given the late hour, but something about the quality of the silence troubled him. It felt too complete, too perfect, as if the chamber had been deliberately emptied of all life and sound. "The entrance mechanism is hidden behind the bookshelf," Sir Geoffrey whispered, pointing to a section of the wall where faint light seeped through gaps in the stonework. "Lord Aldrich showed it to me 3 days ago, when he first revealed the evidence against the king." Marcus examined the mechanism carefully, noting its sophisticated construction. This was not the work of palace servants or even skilled craftsmen. Someone with extensive engineering knowledge had designed and built this system, someone who understood both security and concealment at a level that suggested military or intelligence training. The hidden door opened silently, revealing Aldrich's private study bathed in moonlight from tall windows. The room appeared normal at first glance, with its familiar furniture and carefully organized shelves of books and documents. But as they stepped inside, Marcus immediately noticed that something was wrong. Lord Chancellor Aldrich sat slumped over his desk, his arms spread wide, and his head resting on a pile of papers that were now stained dark with blood. A ornate letter opener protruded from between his shoulder blades, and his eyes stared sightlessly toward the window where the moon cast eerie shadows across his face. Isabella gasped and stepped back instinctively, while Sir Geoffrey rushed forward to check for signs of life. But Marcus remained focused on the broader scene, his military experience telling him to assess the entire situation before reacting to any single detail. "He has been dead for several hours," Sir Geoffrey announced grimly, his fingers finding no pulse at Aldrich's neck. "The blood has already begun to dry." Marcus approached the desk carefully, avoiding disturbing any potential evidence while trying to read the papers beneath Aldrich's body. What he could see appeared to be correspondence, written in multiple hands and bearing official seals from various kingdoms. The top document bore the royal seal of Valeria, confirming that at least some communication had been taking place with foreign powers. "Look at this," Isabella said quietly from across the room. She had discovered a wooden chest, ornately carved and bound with iron, sitting open on a side table. Inside were dozens of documents, maps, and what appeared to be coded messages. "These papers are not like anything I've seen before." Marcus joined her at the chest, leaving Sir Geoffrey to examine Aldrich's body more thoroughly. The documents were indeed unusual, written on paper of a quality and type that did not match anything produced in Eldoria or the neighboring kingdoms. The handwriting was precise and uniform, suggesting the work of professional scribes rather than personal correspondence. "These are forgeries," Isabella said with certainty after examining several documents. "I have seen genuine Valerian diplomatic papers many times. The seals are wrong, the paper is wrong, and even the language contains errors that no native speaker would make." The revelation hit Marcus like a physical blow. If the evidence against King Edmund was fabricated, then the entire conspiracy had been built on false premises. But who had the resources and motivation to create such elaborate deceptions? And what was their ultimate goal? Sir Geoffrey called out from the desk, his voice tight with shock. "Captain, you need to see this immediately." Marcus and Isabella hurried back to where Aldrich's body lay. Sir Geoffrey had carefully moved some of the blood-stained papers, revealing a handwritten note that had been hidden beneath them. The message was brief, but devastating in its implications. "The ravens fly at dawn. The crown falls with the sun. Trust no one who claims friendship, for the serpent wears many faces." The note was signed with a symbol none of them recognized, a complex design that combined elements from several different royal houses. "This looks like a warning," Isabella observed, studying the mysterious symbol. But a warning about what? And from whom? Marcus felt the pieces of a much larger puzzle beginning to fall into place. What if Lord Aldrich discovered the truth about the forged documents? What if he was killed not because he was part of the conspiracy, but because he learned who was really behind it? The possibility that they had all been manipulated by a hidden enemy was terrifying in its implications. If someone with sufficient resources and knowledge could create false evidence convincing enough to turn trusted advisors against their king, then no one in the palace was safe from suspicion and betrayal. "We need to search this room thoroughly," Marcus decided. If Aldrich discovered who was behind the deception, he might have hidden additional evidence before he was killed. They worked quickly, but methodically, searching drawers, examining books for hidden compartments, and checking behind paintings for concealed safes. Isabella's familiarity with secret hiding places proved valuable, as she discovered a hollow space behind a loose stone in the fireplace that contained several additional documents. These new papers told a different story entirely. They included genuine correspondence between Aldrich and various foreign ambassadors, all focused on preventing conflicts rather than creating them. There were also detailed financial records showing large payments from an unknown source to several palace servants, guards, and even some minor nobles. Someone has been buying loyalty and information throughout the palace, Sir Geoffrey realized as he studied the financial records. The payments go back almost 2 years, which means this conspiracy has been developing for much longer than we realized. But it was the final document in Aldrich's hidden cache that provided the most shocking revelation. A partially completed letter, written in Aldrich's own hand, was addressed to King Edmund and began with an urgent warning. "Your Majesty, I have discovered evidence of a plot to overthrow your throne that involved individuals at the highest levels of government and foreign powers working in coordination." The letter went on to detail Aldrich's investigation into suspicious activities he had noticed over the past several months. He had apparently begun to suspect that information was being deliberately leaked to create false impressions and justify actions that would weaken the kingdom. His investigation had led him to believe that someone was orchestrating events to create chaos and confusion, making it easier to seize power during the resulting instability. Lord Aldrich was loyal to the king, Isabella said softly, the relief evident in her voice. He was trying to protect the crown, not overthrow it. Marcus nodded grimly, which means he was killed because he was getting close to exposing the real conspiracy. The question is, who has the power and resources to orchestrate something this elaborate? The answer came from an unexpected source. As they continued searching the room, Sir Geoffrey discovered a hidden compartment in Aldrich's desk that contained a detailed organizational chart. The diagram showed a network of influence and corruption that extended far beyond the palace walls, reaching into the military, the merchant guilds, and even the church hierarchy. At the center of the chart was a name that made all three of them stare in disbelief: General Roderick Hawthorne, the king's own brother-in-law and commander of the royal army. According to Aldrich's research, Hawthorne had been systematically placing his own supporters in key positions throughout the kingdom, while secretly communicating with foreign powers about potential regime change. "This explains everything," Marcus said, his mind racing through the implications. Hawthorne has been using his military position to gather intelligence and place supporters in strategic locations. He created the false evidence against the king to justify a military coup, while simultaneously working with the Valerians to ensure he would have foreign support when he seized power. Isabella nodded, connecting more pieces of the puzzle. And he used me as an unwitting pawn, allowing my presence in the palace to support his claims about foreign infiltration. When I stopped providing information and began to suspect the truth, I became a liability that needed to be eliminated. Sir Geoffrey looked stricken as he realized how completely he had been manipulated. Hawthorne convinced me that we were saving the kingdom from a corrupt king. He showed me evidence that seemed conclusive, and his reputation as a war hero made his claims believable. I never thought to question whether the evidence itself might be fabricated. The sound of footsteps in the passage outside Aldrich's chambers interrupted their discussion. Marcus immediately moved to the hidden entrance, listening carefully to determine whether the approaching persons represented a threat or potential assistance. The footsteps were heavy and numerous, suggesting armed men moving with military precision. "Someone is coming," Marcus whispered urgently. "We need to leave immediately, but we must take these documents with us. They represent the only proof of Hawthorne's guilt." Isabella quickly gathered the most important papers, while Sir Geoffrey extinguished the candles they had lit. Marcus checked his weapons and assessed their options for escape. The passage they had used to enter led back toward the Queen Consort's chambers, but if Hawthorne's agents were conducting a systematic search, that route might already be compromised. "There is another passage," Isabella said quietly, pointing to what appeared to be a solid wall beside the fireplace. Aldrich showed it to me once, claiming it was an emergency escape route that led directly to the stables. "If we can reach the horses, we might be able to get word to the king before Hawthorne realizes we have discovered his plan." The footsteps in the main passage were getting closer, and they could now hear voices speaking in hushed tones. Marcus recognized the voice of Captain Fletcher, one of Hawthorne's most trusted subordinates, giving orders about searching specific rooms for security threats. Marcus realized with growing alarm that Hawthorne was moving much faster than they had anticipated. The general was apparently preparing to implement his coup immediately, possibly within hours rather than days. If the king returned to a palace controlled by Hawthorne's supporters, he would be walking into a carefully prepared trap. "We have to warn him," Marcus said urgently as they prepared to enter the emergency passage. "King Edmund must not return to the palace until we can expose Hawthorne's treachery." But even as they fled through the hidden passages, carrying evidence that could save the kingdom, Marcus knew they faced almost impossible odds. Hawthorne controlled the military, had supporters throughout the government, and possessed detailed knowledge of the palace's defenses and secret ways. Their small group of unlikely allies would have to outmaneuver a conspiracy that had been years in the making, with resources they did not possess and time that was rapidly running out. The race to save the kingdom of Eldoria had begun in earnest, and the outcome would depend on whether truth could move faster than treachery in the corridors of power. The emergency passage led them through the deepest levels of the palace, areas that had not seen regular use for decades. The air was thick with dust and the smell of ancient stone, while strange echoes suggested vast chambers extending beyond the reach of their torchlight. Isabella guided them with growing confidence, her familiarity with the secret network proving invaluable as they navigated through chambers that had once served as storage for siege supplies. As they moved through the underground maze, Marcus used the time to formulate a plan that might give them a chance of success against seemingly impossible odds. Hawthorne controlled the palace guard, had supporters throughout the military hierarchy, and possessed detailed intelligence about every aspect of the castle's defenses. But he also had weaknesses that might be exploited by people who understood his psychology and methods. Hawthorne's greatest strength is also his greatest weakness. Marcus explained to his companions as they paused to rest and treat his wounds with supplies Isabella had found in an abandoned medical cache. He thinks like a general, which means he plans for conventional threats and expects his enemies to behave predictably. He will not be prepared for the kind of unconventional approach that desperation might inspire. Sir Geoffrey nodded thoughtfully, his earlier shame at being deceived now transformed into determination to make amends. "What did you have in mind, Captain?" "The king is not due to return until tomorrow evening, which gives us perhaps 18 hours to expose the conspiracy and rally loyal supporters." Isabella spread out the maps she had taken from Aldrich's chambers, studying them by torchlight with the expertise of someone trained in intelligence analysis. According to these documents, Hawthorne has been careful to avoid placing too many of his supporters in any single location. He has distributed them strategically throughout the palace and the city, which makes his network harder to detect, but also more vulnerable if we can strike at multiple points simultaneously. Marcus studied the organizational chart they had discovered, noting the careful balance Hawthorne had maintained between military efficiency and political discretion. The general has made one crucial mistake in his planning. He has assumed that loyalty can be bought and that people will remain loyal to whoever pays them the most. But some forms of loyalty cannot be purchased, and those are the people we need to find. They spent the next hour developing a plan that was audacious in its scope and desperate in its execution. Rather than trying to confront Hawthorne's conspiracy directly, they would expose it publicly in a way that would make it impossible for the general to deny or suppress the evidence. The plan required them to split up, each taking on tasks that played to their individual strengths while coordinating their efforts for maximum impact. Isabella would use her knowledge of the palace's social dynamics to approach specific nobles and servants who had demonstrated genuine loyalty to the king over many years. Her status as queen consort, despite the questions about her past, still carried enough authority to demand attention and consideration from people who mattered in the political hierarchy. Sir Geoffrey would use his connections within the guard and military to identify officers who had not been compromised by Hawthorne's influence. His reputation for honesty and his obvious distress at being deceived would lend credibility to his warnings about the conspiracy, particularly among soldiers who valued personal integrity above political advancement. Marcus would take on the most dangerous task, infiltrating Hawthorne's stronghold in the military headquarters to gather additional evidence and, if possible, disrupt the general's plans for the coup. His knowledge of military protocols and his reputation as an elite soldier would help him move through areas where the others could not go. The emergency passage finally brought them to a concealed exit in the palace stables, emerging behind stacks of hay that had clearly been arranged to hide the entrance. The stables were quiet except for the gentle sounds of horses resting in their stalls, but Marcus noticed immediately that there were fewer animals present than usual. Someone had been moving horses out of the palace, possibly to prepare for rapid transportation during the coup. They separated at the stable entrance, each heading toward their assigned objectives with a mixture of determination and fear. The next few hours would determine whether the kingdom of Eldoria continued under legitimate rule or fell to a carefully orchestrated military takeover that had been years in the making. Marcus made his way toward the military headquarters through streets that seemed unusually quiet for the early morning hours. As he approached the fortress-like building where Hawthorne maintained his offices, he noticed an increased number of guards at positions that were normally only lightly defended. The general was clearly preparing for something significant, confirming their suspicions about the timing of his planned coup. Using skills learned during his early years as a scout, Marcus managed to infiltrate the building through a service entrance that was guarded by soldiers he recognized as loyal to the crown rather than to Hawthorne personally. His reputation allowed him to move through the initial checkpoints without arousing suspicion, but he knew that deeper penetration would require more careful planning. The breakthrough came when Marcus encountered Lieutenant Davies, a young officer he had trained personally and who had always demonstrated unwavering loyalty to proper military protocols. Davies was clearly troubled by recent changes in the headquarters atmosphere, and when Marcus carefully approached him with questions about unusual orders or preparations, the lieutenant's responses confirmed their worst fears. General Hawthorne has been calling in favors and issuing emergency deployment orders for the past week. Davies revealed in hushed tones. Units that were supposed to be on routine patrol have been repositioned around key locations in the capital, including the roads leading to and from the palace. When I questioned the strategic logic, I was told that intelligence indicated possible foreign threats to the king's safety. Marcus realized that Hawthorne had been using legitimate security concerns to position his supporters where they could control the situation when the coup began. The general's military background had taught him to plan thoroughly and maintain operational security, making it difficult for anyone to see the overall pattern until it was too late to prevent. "Lieutenant, I need you to listen very carefully to what I am about to tell you," Marcus said, making a decision that could cost both their lives if Davies proved to be compromised. "General Hawthorne is planning to overthrow King Edmund, and he has been preparing for this action for at least 2 years. Lord Chancellor Aldrich discovered the truth and was murdered to prevent him from warning the king." The accusation was so serious that Davies initially reacted with disbelief, but Marcus's reputation for honesty and his obvious wounds from recent combat lent credibility to his claims. When Marcus showed him copies of the organizational chart and financial records they had discovered in Aldrich's chambers, the young lieutenant's expression changed from skepticism to horror. "Sir, if what you're saying is true, then half the officers I work with every day are traitors to the crown. How can we possibly expose something this extensive without triggering the very action we're trying to prevent?" Marcus had been wrestling with the same question, but he had reached a conclusion that represented their only realistic chance of success. "We cannot prevent Hawthorne from attempting his coup, but we can ensure that it fails by making sure the right people are prepared for it. The general's plan depends on surprise and the assumption that his version of events will be accepted without question. If we can eliminate both of those advantages, his conspiracy will collapse." Working together, Marcus and Davies identified a group of approximately 20 officers and senior sergeants who had not received payment from Hawthorne's network and whose loyalty to the crown was beyond question. Using the military's existing communication protocols, they began to discreetly spread word about the conspiracy, providing just enough evidence to convince each person without revealing the full scope of what they knew. Meanwhile, Isabella was conducting her own campaign among the noble families and senior servants who formed the palace's political and social hierarchy. Her approach was necessarily more subtle, as she had to overcome suspicions about her own loyalty while building support for actions that might seem treasonous themselves if presented incorrectly. The breakthrough came when Isabella approached Lady Margaret Fairfax, the king's elderly aunt and one of the most respected voices in the royal court. Lady Fairfax had survived multiple political upheavals during her long life, and her experience had taught her to recognize the signs of palace intrigue long before others noticed anything unusual. "My dear Isabella," Lady Fairfax said after listening to the Queen Consort's carefully worded concerns, "I have been wondering when someone would finally notice what General Hawthorne has been doing. The man's ambition has always exceeded his wisdom, and his recent behavior has been particularly troubling." With Lady Fairfax's support, Isabella was able to approach other nobles who had been harboring their own doubts about recent events. The revelation that their individual concerns were part of a larger pattern helped crystallize opposition to Hawthorne's plans, creating a foundation for resistance that the general had not anticipated. Sir Geoffrey's efforts among the guards and palace security proved equally successful, as his obvious distress at being deceived by the conspiracy convinced several key figures that the threat was real and immediate. Captain Willem Ashford, the head of the king's personal guard, was particularly valuable as an ally, as his men controlled access to the royal quarters and could prevent Hawthorne from seizing control of the palace's most sensitive areas. By mid-afternoon, the three parts of their plan had created a network of awareness and preparation that extended throughout the palace and into the military hierarchy. But they had also triggered increased activity among Hawthorne's supporters, who were apparently responding to reports that their security had been compromised. The final confrontation came sooner than any of them had expected. General Hawthorne, realizing that his carefully laid plans were unraveling, decided to accelerate his timeline and attempt to seize control immediately rather than risk further exposure. But his hasty action meant that he could not implement all the careful preparations that had been designed to ensure success. When Hawthorne supporters moved to secure key locations throughout the palace, they found themselves facing organized resistance from loyal guards and officers who had been warned and prepared for exactly this scenario. The fighting was brief, but intense, as neither side could afford to allow the other to gain control of strategic positions. The decisive moment came when King Edmund himself returned to the palace earlier than expected, having received warning messages that Marcus had arranged to be delivered through loyal contacts. Instead of walking into a trap, the king found himself supported by guards and nobles who were ready to defend his legitimate rule against Hawthorne's coup attempt. Faced with the collapse of his conspiracy and the prospect of capture or death, General Hawthorne made a final desperate attempt to escape the kingdom with his most devoted supporters. But the same network of positioned troops that he had planned to use to control the capital became a liability when those troops remained loyal to the crown and worked to prevent his flight. The general was captured at the harbor as he attempted to board a ship that would have taken him to sanctuary in a neighboring kingdom where he had apparently been negotiating asylum in exchange for military intelligence. The discovery of detailed invasion plans among his possessions confirmed that his conspiracy had extended far beyond simple political ambition to include the actual betrayal of the kingdom to foreign enemies. In the aftermath of the failed coup, King Edmund addressed the assembled court with a mixture of gratitude and determination. He praised the loyalty of those who had risked their lives to preserve legitimate rule, while acknowledging that the conspiracy's near success revealed serious weaknesses in the kingdom's defenses that would need to be addressed. Isabella found herself in an unusual position, having transformed from suspected spy to hero of the realm through a crucial role in exposing the conspiracy. Her decision to choose loyalty to her adopted homeland over the demands of her birth country had ultimately saved the kingdom, earning her a place of honor that no one could question. Marcus received recognition for his leadership in coordinating the resistance to Hawthorne's coup, but he knew that the real victory belonged to all the individuals who had chosen duty and loyalty over personal safety. The secret passages beneath the palace would be sealed or heavily monitored to prevent future security breaches, but the greater lesson was about the importance of maintaining networks of trust and communication that could not be compromised by gold or intimidation. Sir Geoffrey dedicated himself to rooting out the remaining supporters of Hawthorne's conspiracy and reforming the military security procedures to prevent future penetration by hostile influences. His experience of being deceived had taught him valuable lessons about the subtle ways that loyalty could be undermined and good intentions manipulated for evil purposes. The kingdom of Eldoria had survived its greatest internal threat through the courage and dedication of people who understood that some things were worth defending regardless of personal cost. But the experience had also taught them that vigilance and wisdom were eternal requirements for those who would preserve justice and legitimate rule in a world where ambition and treachery never sleep. The story of the Royal Guard's discovery had become the story of a kingdom's salvation, proving that even the most carefully planned conspiracy could be defeated by individuals who chose to stand together for truth and loyalty when the stakes could not be higher.